about ready to get started. If you guys in the back of the room are ready there, okay. First off, we're just delighted to welcome all of you, whether you're in person or on Zoom, to our third session of Concord and Carlisle, our communities through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. Tonight is our third program, and we are going to focus on housing. And just want to remind you that on November 10th, there will be a recap of all three sessions and interactive conversation about where do we go from here. That will also be at Tricon. This session which is available on Zoom, is also being taped, and the video should be available in a couple of days. Those of you who are in the room may find on your chair an evaluation survey for the State League. If you got it, that's great. I don't think there's enough for everybody. Everybody will receive a survey online. Please complete it because we value your thoughts about the program, and it's going to help us plan for future events. As in the past, we ask that you hold questions until after all three panelists have finished their presentations. At that time, we will accept questions from the audience, whether in the room or on Zoom. If you are physically here, you should find a little notepad, a little card and a pencil to write down your questions, and they will be collected. The DEI Committee of the League of Women Voters could not have done this without Concord-Carlisle, a doubt in community education. And we thank them for hosting this program and for the many people who have supported us. I should note that the League's first Friday, which is an informative meeting, will be on November 4th, and the topic will be housing. If you look on the League website, you can find, you can go to the calendar. Thank you. And so I think that's all. You don't have to listen to me any longer. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for tonight, who we're very happy to have back, Grant Hightower.
All right, Concord, good evening. It is truly a blessing to be back in your presence, and thank you again for taking the time to make space to have conversations that are really important in the community. And so I don't want to take too much of the panelists' times, but I just wanted to thank the League. I wanted to thank our esteemed panelists. I want to thank you all again for making this a priority, not only for yourselves, but for your community and for the future of that community. I'm going to introduce our three panelists in the order that they're going to speak. The first is Lily Geismer. She is an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College. She researches and teaches about recent political and urban history in the United States with a focus on liberalism and the Democratic Party. She is the author of Left Behind: How the Democrats Failed to Solve Inequality and Don't Blame Us, Suburban Liberals and the Transformation of the Democratic Party. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, New Republic, Jacobin, and Dissent, and on NPR and other podcasts. A native of Massachusetts and a Concord Academy grad, Geismer currently resides in Los Angeles. Liz Rust is the director of the Regional Housing Services Office. Rust has over 15 years' experience with Massachusetts affordable housing programs and regulations from many aspects and a current focus on the municipal perspective, helping Metro West communities and their residents with all aspects of affordable housing. Rust directs Innovative Regional Housing Service Office, an intermunicipal collaborative between Acton, Bedford, Concord, Lexington, Lincoln, Maynard, Sudbury, Wayland, and Weston. Additionally, Rust assists other municipalities in affordable housing planning and monitoring efforts as an independent contractor. Lastly, we have Keith Bergman. He's a Concord Municipal Affordable Housing Trust Chair. He's retired after 37 years as a municipal manager in Massachusetts, serving the towns of Nantucket, North Andover, Scituate, Provincetown, and Littleton, and currently volunteers as the ICMA, MMA, Senior Advisor to Active Managers and Assistants. Bergman lives in Concord, where he chaired the town's Affordable Housing Trust Study Committee from 2019 to 2020, and has chaired its Municipal Affordable Housing Trust since its establishment in 2021. Bergman is a past resident of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or the MAPC, the regional planning agency for the 101 cities and towns in Metro Boston, and currently represents the town of Concord on the MAPC Council. Bergman was recognized by the Massachusetts Housing Partnership as one of its housing heroes in 2019. So please give them a round of applause before they start. So I believe we're going to start first with our with Lily Geismer, who is going to be joining us on Zoom.
It's such a pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm sorry to be there virtually. I'm coming from sunny Southern California, and you can see the sun is like blaring on my face because it's still the late afternoon here. And I want to just thank Elizabeth Cobbs and Nancy Brown and Jackie Jones for coordinating and inviting me to participate, and for all of you for being here. Concord holds a very special place in my heart as a CA alum, and so I'm especially happy that I hear that there's some Concord Academy alum or current students in the audience. So I'm going to use my brief time tonight to give some historical context about Concord's history of fair and affordable housing, drawn from my book, Don't Blame Us, Suburban Liberals and the Transformation of the Democratic Party, which looks primarily at the Route 128 suburbs, especially Concord, Lexington, Lincoln, Newton, and Brookline. And you can see that from the cover of the book there. I always say that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I like the cover of my book a lot, so you can judge it from that. But it does look extensively at various different aspects of Concord's history. And I'm going to focus primarily on these questions around housing, since that's the focus of the panel. One of the things I particularly want to focus on is this convergence and tensions of Concord's historical priorities, that of equality and tolerance, and then also environmentalism and open space, and how they really came into tension, especially in the late 1960s. Both of these trends have their roots in the post-war period, when the U.S., especially metropolitan Boston, underwent intense transformation. And what happens in the post-war period is you have these shifts of work and residence, especially the shift of industry towards the Route 128 area. And developers in Concord begin to subdivide former estates and farms into multiple lots, leading the population to grow substantially. These dual pressures from sort of industry, the encroaching industry and new families caused a lot of anxiety among local officials and residents, and began to use certain kinds of zoning mechanisms such to control land development and population controls. And in the mid-1950s, Concord revised its zoning code to establish a 1 acre plot minimum, limit new construction to single family detached homes, and prevent almost all commercial and industrial development in order to maintain historical charm. And the establishment of local historic preservation ordinances gave the town officials further power to kind of to preserve the historical integrity of their community. This also became another barrier to new construction, including multifamily housing and mass-produced homes. And it ensured that Concord was attractive and did not look like a typical post-war suburb, but also became quite exclusive, since it prevented anyone to move into the town who could not afford to buy a single-family home on a large lot, and further plays a critical role in the economic and racial segregation in the Boston area. And I should note that Concord was not unique in these patterns. It was happening throughout many of the other affluent suburbs in Boston. In Concord, residents started to believe that having a 1 acre minimum zoning policy was not enough, and was only a sort of a partial solution, and start to take actions like forming the Concord Land Conservation Trust, which had the mandate to assist and promote the preservation of the rural character of the town. This program of purchasing land and putting under a trust was further abetted by the formation of the state of Massachusetts Conservation Commission program, which encouraged towns to start their own conservation commissions, and then had started a program to reimburse towns up to 50% for their conservation commission's land acquisitions. And so in Concord, what ends up happening in the 1950s and 1960s is that the town meeting allocated the maximum amount allowed by the state to participate in the initiative. Other historic preservation and conservation activities at the state and at the state and federal level actually also really increased this process with the creation of Walden Pond and Minuteman National Park. And if you turn the slide now. So what ends up happening is by the late 1960s, over 1/4 of the total acreage of Concord had come under state, federal, local, or privately owned conservation land. And this is particularly striking given the proximity to Route 128. So this is a map of Concord, Lincoln, and Lexington, and you can see all the land that is under under conservation. And it sets up larger issues, which I'm just to sort of prefigure, in efforts to address the issue of affordable housing. What's important too is that these policies were not just aesthetic in their formation. The town Concord's recognized that sort of buying up a lot of land was what they called a bargain or a wise investment, because it would save the town costs of many services, especially if you had to do multi-housing development. So the idea of having these policies was another way of kind of providing better services at a lower cost, and that was kind of part of the project as well. From what I found in the archives, and I spent a great deal of time at the Concord Public Library looking through historical records, the local planners focus little to no attention, however, on how the decisions to adopt these policies like minimum acre zoning and conservation, buying up, conservation commission programs would impact metropolitan Boston as a whole, particularly the growing problems of racial and economic equality. And the forces of urban development would really, of suburban growth and urban development, really come to constrict the region's non-white population. So I didn't have this on the map, but at the same time, you have a lot of this land being bought up. By the early 1960s, 80% of Boston's African-American population remained largely confined to 15 contiguous census tracts in the city. And this is really what this problem becomes, what an affordable housing movement in Concord and other suburban communities start to address by the late 1960s. But this movement actually has its roots in an earlier grassroots movement that emerged a decade earlier around the issues of fair and open housing. If you can change the slide now. So throughout the Route 128 suburbs, many residents begin to, in the late 1950s and 1960s, become shocked to learn about the difficulty that African Americans were facing finding housing in the suburbs. And it fuels a movement that spreads quickly around the Boston suburbs. Which is the development of these fair housing committees. The Concord one was called the Fair Housing Practices Committee. And these committees aim to help individual African-American families gain access to local real estate using tactics like testing. They also staged protests. And they also did door-to-door signature campaigns called Good Neighbors for Fair Housing, which were asking local residents to pledge not to discriminate. These groups often used expansive terms and ideas of equal opportunity and freedom of choice, but what they really meant is they wanted everyone who could afford to be able to live in their communities. So you can see that in this pamphlet that I found from the Lexington Committee, with this idea that primarily helping middle class African Americans move into their communities. And I think one of the things is that the other disconnect that ends up happening is that many of the committees are the most active fair housing committees, like Lexington and Concord, also had some of the metropolitan area's most expensive housing stock. And so what you can see that's, like, for instance, in Concord, most of the houses available. So they had like long lists of people who are willing to sell their house to an African-American family, but it was they cost about $16,000 to $20,000, which now sounds ridiculous, but at that time was expensive. If you can change the slide. And so these are all the towns that had fair housing fair housing chapters, or the towns that are in gray, and the number of placements in each of those towns. And you can see it's a very small number. And Concord actually had no placements, even though they had lots of houses that were available. The other thing that these committees did was actually to work to change the state fair housing laws, and they were able to get Massachusetts to pass one of the most progressive fair housing laws in the country. But it's really important that these laws only address discrimination in rental and sales, and didn't address issues like exclusionary zoning policies, and also offered little assistance to the majority of African Americans who could not afford housing outside of highly segregated neighborhoods. So many members of this movement recognized that affordable housing was a critical issue, and had been clamoring really since the early 1960s that that was kind of should be the next sort of arena in which this fair housing movement should move. And now if you can change the slide again. So there's a couple of things that sort of give this new push from fair housing to affordable housing impetus, and one is in 1968. The publication of the Kerner Commission report, which was released in the aftermath of the urban uprisings in the 1960s, and made the sharp conclusion about racial and spatial divisions in the United States, and really sparked a national discussion about the need to increase housing opportunities for people of color and for poor people outside of central cities. And the Kerner Commission report, coupled with the assassination of Martin Luther King, sparks many people throughout metropolitan Boston to start sort of thinking seriously about these questions. In Concord, the community started a study group where they read the Kerner Commission report and sort of began to think about this question about the fact that, like, in Concord in the late 1960s, there were about 200 African-American residents, but they were primarily largely middle class, if not upper middle class. And so that they really said that the need now was to kind of turn to what was called low-income housing. And so that kind of is where the community should turn to, and started to take grassroots action. This coincides, this effort of kind of this grassroots movement coincides with a push from the state legislature to also address the issue of affordable housing, largely by tackling the issue of exclusionary zoning. And this is the famous passage of the law in Massachusetts, 40B, which at the time was called the Anti-Snob Zoning Act. It established a two-step administrative process, and which, if any of you know, it's a quite complicated sort of set of circumstances, but the first is that in communities where affordable housing units comprise less than 10% of the total number of units of low-income units, housing developers have the ability to appeal those to appeal, and then it gives like a larger state board the power to override those decisions. And I think it's important, I mean, that this law was really important in kind of establishing sort of certain kinds of, like symbolically, the question of Massachusetts being progressive on these issues, but it had a lot of mechanisms for delay. And these questions played themselves out quite prominently in Concord itself. So following up on the study that they had done, residents in Concord make moves to build a low and moderate income development in Concord. And they drew up plans for the development, which aimed to fit in with the sort of local aesthetic of the community. If you can turn the slide. And there's I have the brochure from the Concord Homeowning Corporation. It was actually designed by Carl Koch, the same person who designed Conantum. And the actually making up the plans for this was the easy part. The much harder part was to find a place, to finding a plot of land for the project. So at the time, Concord only had 29 acres of land available for multi-unit development. And the few eligible parcels either had significant water problems or unwilling settlers. So they finally, after looking for a long time, found a 5.5 acre plot on Sudbury Road near the town center, adjacent to the Stop and Shop, which I guess is now called Crotzy's Marketplace. And it was for sale by the Wheeler family. And it seemed like a really great place to have a development because it was close to the town center and also to the commuter rail line. One of the major issues was water and soil conditions on the property. And since it sat actually on a 90-acre watershed. And the residents of the adjacent community immediately argued that this was a poor place to put a development because it was going to affect the precarious ecology of the area, and they already had overworked some pumps, and they didn't want something that would kind of further for that problem. They found their own organization called the Southbrook Preservation Association. And these two groups engage in a multi-year battle that goes through, actually, it's one of the first cases to test 40B. It goes through the entire 40B process. Ultimately, the development goes to the state Supreme Court, who rules that it should go forward. And then the next stage was to actually get it approved by the state's Natural Resources Commission, who eventually block the construction on this property because of the fact that they said that it was in a wetland. It's a much more complicated story, which many of you might have lived through, and I'm happy to parse out the details. I'm seeing that I don't have very much time left. But I think one of the things a couple of years later, the town of Concord itself bought the property, and now it stands as another parcel of open space. I think that there's a couple of different lessons here. I mean, and I would also say this kind of case is not unique to Concord, that throughout the country, there's many instances where you have cases around affordable housing where you have local housing activists and environmentalists fighting one another. And the vast majority of these cases end up where the case of that happened here of the preservation of open space and economic exclusivity and a dearth of mixed income housing and racial and economic diversity. I think it's really important. One of the other major lessons of this story is that not every suburbanite was opposed to the concept of having affordable housing in their communities, and many residents fought really hard and really long to try to get this development established. But oftentimes they've come to fall short. And one of the things I think that there's really was not at the time a lot of discussion about why or what reasons was this the only piece of land in Concord such to build that a development could exist on. And it didn't really has never really led affordable housing proponents or environmentalists to recognize that they actually in many ways are fighting against the same enemies, like state subsidized suburbanization, the R&D industry, and also just these general sort of the lack of both open space and socioeconomic diversity in the suburbs, which largely contributed to intensifying patterns of inequality in Boston. So I rushed through the end. I'm sorry. I'm happy to answer more questions about this. But I really hope that this sort of sets up, as I know these are many issues that are very much ongoing in Concord, and I know that those are things that Liz and Keith are both going to talk about. So I'll turn it over to them. Thank you so much.
Here we go. Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Rust, and I'm delighted to be here tonight and really honored to be invited to present. And it's really great to go after Lily and her fabulously informative and historical perspective. My message today is about action, getting in the game, making things happen, so that having some of that background, what can we do to change the story? My slides, yep. So there we go, in the arena. There we go. So next slide, please. So I'm going to steal from Teddy Roosevelt, right? So it's not the critic that counts. Like, we can all do that. We can sit here and on the sidelines Everyone can criticize a project, every housing project, none of them are perfect. This is the wrong site, it's too high, it's too dense, it's this, it's whatever it is, right? But how to do it better, to get in the arena, to work on and to make it happen. How to get to yes, not why is no. And this is what, again, so I'm the director of the Regional Housing Services Office. You can do the next slide, right? Because that's really, here I am right here. So this is my office. So we work really in the trenches. We are in the arena. We are dusty all day long, right? And there's a lot that goes on in these communities. I know Lily talked about way back then, Concord buying land so it wouldn't go to a housing. That happened 2 years ago in Sudbury. There was someone coming in to do housing, and everyone said, no, let's just buy that land so there's no housing there. So this is definitely something that happens. All of these stories happen over and over. The particulars are all different, and the projects and all of that, but the same thoughts are, the same trends. Anyway, so this is our office. Concord is the host for the Regional Housing Service Office. We have an on-site office. We're in with the school buses, you know, over there on Knox Trail, right? Because we're happening, we're moving, you know? And and we administer affordable housing for all these communities. So this is the housing that's in place, residents looking to buy, residents looking to lease, new projects coming in, towns trying to fund projects. So we have a wide perspective on all the things. And I know Concord is special, and I know Concord is unique, and I live in Concord, so I really feel that. But there is something that is all the same, right? It's you know, all the communities are really going through the same kinds of struggles. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight why, you know, the focusing on diversity is really well placed. I mean, this is great that you're doing that, and I really applaud the work of the League and the DEI committee and everyone who's putting on these panels. We've heard about the history, and it's really a burdensome history, both public policy and private action. So you really have very powerful forces that have been going on for, you know, centuries. So it's hard, like we can't just like have a little committee meeting and like, oh, we're gonna like fix all this, right? And for, yeah. So, and then the population, right? If we just look at the Black population, so Concord has 3% compared to the state, 7%. And of that 3%, half of the people are in the prisons. So we think that 3% is so low, like, but it's really low, right? So it's not a very diverse community from that perspective. And then from housing, I think I had some numbers here. So single-family homes have increased 70% in 10 years. And the to 1.2 million. I mean, that's really out of sight, right? And then income has increased 34%, and that's the median income. Those are the median values. From, I mean, even those are pretty high, right? From an affordable housing perspective, Concord's a very slow producer of affordable housing, very slow. I think a net 8 units over 10 years. With all the money, all the effort, all the committees, all the hearings, I can't even tell you how many presentations I've done on affordable housing for net 8 units over 10 years. So, and they are hard to produce because it costs more to build than to, you know, than rents you get or what you're going to get. So always public money coming in. But next slide, please. Concord has resources. Right? There's a lot of time and talent and treasure in this community. People, right? Look at you all. Like you came to hear me. Great. But you know, and financial resources. There's the community preservation money that is available, town property, as well as capacity and infrastructure. So there's a lot here to work on. But as I say, right, it's just not enough. All the plans in the world, all the water, all the money that's out there doesn't actually make the housing. It's not enough to have those things. Those are just tools that you use to actually implement the housing. Like you actually have to do this implementation step. So just having all that is great. I don't want to discourage that because a lot of places don't have all that resource. but by themselves, they can't overcome our lack of diversity, our lack of entrenched systematic diversity, lack of diversity. And next slide, please. Nope, one more. Yeah. Okay, so I call this is like the get dirty slide, right? Like the view from the arena. So this is actually what we see. I wondered about whether I was really going to put this in here, but I figured, okay, right? So Concord has had 2 major setbacks in just 6 months, representing years of work, hours and hours of effort by volunteers. The first is the failed zoning, really right where that project is that Lily talked about, like right there. Still trying to work out what to do right over there. There's a lot of like land there. So 3 years, I think maybe the state experts came in, public forums, like all those little signs on the side of the road, come to the Wheeler, to Harvey Wheeler, hear about this, and it goes to town meeting. I never heard of this. Why didn't anyone tell me? And they worked for years and years. So that was a failed zoning. That was the Thoreau district zoning. And then the collapse of the Junction Village affordable housing effort. This is really hot off the press, right? So I think this is like really over the last, I don't know, the ink on the termination agreements are still being signed, right? So that's also a project, 13 years maybe, for sure. I think 3 years just to get the land, negotiation with the state to get the land. It was old prison land. It's not even great land. Who wants to live in the, like you're looking out there, there's the tower with the guys with the guns, right? So, not great land, but even then, got the land, did all that, proposed family housing, too many cars, can't have those darn children. They're like nuclear waste in terms of planning, right? Like, can't have those kids. So assisted living, brought the, but the problem is that land required it be all affordable housing. So, and as I mentioned before, that's all about the money. So you need so much money to create affordable housing. Usually developers have some affordable housing and some market rate housing. And the profit they make here can kind of make up for this over here. So it kind of works. When it's all affordable, it just needs all money, right? So town money, state money, all this. And then COVID needs more money, and it just fell apart. But it really was a huge effort for many people. It was in all the plans, right? It was in the select board plans. It was in the housing production plan. Like, we all want this project, we all want this project. And it went down pretty quick, I have to say. And then we hear strong opposition at public meetings. I think that's called nice words, right? Like, we hear a lot of things. People say things that they would never say to anyone else, really. The things that people kind of come out with. But there's all sorts of reasons, and people are smart. It's a little veiled. But people say, I don't want. That's like a slum. I don't want the slum, or I don't want those people moving in, or it's too dense, or my water, or my this, or my that, right? And you always get the opponents at the public hearings. The supporters don't really come out as much. So you hear more the opposition. We see inequitable affordable housing being permitted and built. And I think that everyone could. If you drive around some development that has affordable housing, it's pretty easy to spot it. Like, everyone has the garages, and then here's the one with all the cars outside. Oh, that must be the affordable house, right? Or these are all 3 bedrooms, and then here's like a little box of a house. That's the affordable house. You have the 3 bedrooms, and the affordable house is going to be the 1 bedroom. So they have to do an affordable unit, but they don't, so we see that. We see a bias against families. Again, those children, no one wants those children. But now the town's getting older and older and older, and yet we need to encourage families and children to come in so that they can do all this work on these committees and be, civically involved, right? But I don't know, we don't want to educate them maybe, or maybe they're too loud. I don't know what it is, but we don't want them. We want all the affordable housing. We want the multifamily housing, 2 bedrooms, really. One, if we could do it, we would do all one bedroom, maybe two. If you make me, I'll do three, a few 3 bedrooms. And so I just threw this in because there's a lot of material, but we're going to be doing some fair housing testing coming up in the next year. So Concord's part of the HOME Consortium, which is HOME is a federal program, and they're very concerned about fair housing and fair housing discrimination and disparate impact. Disparate impact is that term that when policies, practices, and rules and other systems that appear neutral result in a disproportionate impact on a protected group. So you don't think that maybe your policies have that kind of effect, but it doesn't matter what they are. It's really all about the effect at the end. If in the end you have a discriminatory effect, there's a fair housing issue there, and that's what they call that. Yeah, so I'll just leave with all that. Yep. I don't really know. I didn't really check my time, right? Okay, so so what can you do, right? So this is the yes, right? You know, move to action, right? So my action plan for you is to show up, right? You're here tonight. That's great. It's really the voting and supporting local efforts, showing up at these public hearings. If there's an affordable housing project, you can just kind of go with the experts that think it's a good project and just support them. You might not need to read the engineering reports to determine whether you think that the engineers have done a good job. You might just go, wow, they got these subject matter experts, and I'm just going to support that. No project is perfect. It really isn't. No project is perfect. We know that. But we do want to support the good while we work for the perfect. We want to change the conversation, right? Diversity is an economic and social benefit. It's not like this charitable gesture, like we're just going to drop some affordable housing in the bin at Crosby's and like we're done. Like we want to enrich our community. Diversity is good. In Sudbury, they have this, I don't know if everyone knows where the Whole Foods is in Sudbury, right? Maybe some nods, right? So that used to be the old Raytheon nothing. And they were going to make it, they have an Avalon there, and they have this, and then they have the Whole Foods. And I was like, oh, it's going to be awful. Oh, that's traffic and this. And it is so vibrant. It has really increased the vitality of that whole area. And people are like, oh, it's great. It's the same people who complained at all the hearings. Like, they all love it now. You know, I live in West Concord, which is pretty dense, right? Everyone's like, oh, we don't want all this density, but we love West Concord. And I'm like, well, like, I just don't understand, right? We're trying to replicate the density, but then on the other hand, we don't want density. It's like, no, it is the same density. It's all the same. Like the houses are close together. We like that. We like that. That's the idea, right? That was the zoning in Crosby's. Like all that parking lot could be vibrant, right? That whole Thoreau district, like you drive from Bedford Farms to Crosby's. Like, I mean, it's not a walk, you know? So anyway, never mind. So then, right, change happens when the community comes together. So it's really about the people and to get behind the projects. And then I had couldn't decide, two quotes, so I'll pick this one. It's Edward Everett Hale's quote. So, I am only one, but still I am one. And I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do something that I can do. So that's my message. Get out there and do something that you can do.
All right, you all were in the presence of some testimony tonight, so that was beautiful. So last and certainly not least, we're bringing to the stage Keith Bergman.
Thanks very much. After Liz, I think, like, in considering where we are, can I have an amen? Amen. Well, I want to thank our hosts, the League's DEI Committee and the Concord-Carlisle Adult and Community Education for hosting this series. I'm honored to be part of tonight's panel with Lily, Liz, and Grant, and all of you. Again, I'm Keith Bergman, Chair of the Concord Municipal Affordable Housing Trust, been a town manager type for 37 years, and now I'm volunteering on housing. And so this seems like a supportive group. You really appreciated the reactions that the speakers have got tonight. So I feel like I can share some things with you. First is, there's a confession. My support for multifamily housing is the reason why I have never been elected to public office. That I only ran for office one time. It was for town meeting member in my hometown of Danvers in 1980. I'd grown up there, was interning at town hall, and wrote a letter to the editor in opposition to a downzoning that was on the town meeting warrant to rezone a whole section of town that had always been multifamily, and they wanted to rezone it to single family. And I said, for those of my high school classmates that wanted to remain in town, we needed more housing choices, not fewer. But an adult supervisor of one of the youth groups I'd long been involved with set me straight on it, and he said, gee, I was all set to vote for you until I read your letter. So I've been an appointed official ever since. And the other confession is that, and I'm really I'm embarrassed about this, but studying for a master's degree in city and regional planning at Harvard 40 years ago, there had been little focus on the racist roots of zoning or how government policies had led to de jure segregation all across the country. And I tell you, it hit home to me. How did I miss that the federally insured home loan that my father could get as a World War II veteran to buy the house that I grew up in had not been an opportunity open to my dad's comrades of color. And the fact is, back then, we didn't really view land use, zoning, and housing through a diversity and equity and lens, and I'm glad that we're doing it now in high time. Next slide, please. Concord audience, Thoreau quote, I desire that there may be as many different persons in the world as possible. I had to look that up. Actually, my wife looked it up because she used to be the executive director at the Thoreau birthplace. But I'm going to say it again. I desire that there may be as many different persons in the world as possible. So that's, we'll have a moment of silence on that. Next slide, please. But we have an important opportunity to write. Now, that was a great writer. Here's an important opportunity for us to write Concord's future. And not only write it down, but to make it R-I-G-H-T, right. And to its credit, the Concord Select Board, that we may have other issues with on housing tonight, did adopt 2 diversity, equity, and inclusion goals this year to guide our efforts here. And I think the series of panels that the League is supporting greatly supports the community conversation we need to have around it. The Select Board's first goal is to work with the town's DEI Commission to research and implement diversity, equity, and inclusion best practices in town governance, and to listen to diverse voices in the community and assess which additional DEI actions the Select Board should take. And I want to give a shout out to the Concord DEI Commission. I think I saw several members of the commission here tonight, and there's Rose, the co-chair, and other members as well. Please, why don't you stand up and take a bow so that we know who you are, because you're doing important work. Thank you. Thanks so much. The Select Board's second goal is to provide input to the town's housing production plan to maximize the equity and diversity impacts of future affordable housing initiatives. and to review and adopt that plan. And that's what I want to sort of focus on, and where does that all fit in? And it's the local housing production plan it's a 5-year plan which needs to be adopted by a select board and a planning board in a town. And then it's submitted for approval by the state. It's approved by the Department of Housing and Community Development. And the town asks much of the state. The state approves our home rule petitions, and they offer state policy and administrative support when we need it, and even state funding when we ask for it. So that achieving and maintaining the 10% goal under Chapter 40B is an important part of us holding up our end in our partnership with state government, and they're closely watching what we do here on housing. Concord's most recent housing production plan, which was approved in 2016, expired last year. And for a community which is about to fall below 10% under its goal under Chapter 40B, because we won't have those 83 units at Junction Village that we were hoping to count on. They're not there. That's why for the 10 years worth of work, we got 8 instead of more than 90. That's, but the fact is, having an approved housing production plan is particularly important for a community that falls below 10%. And so this is a timely exercise that we are updating the housing production plan right now. Because what happens when you fall below 10%? You are open to a so-called unfriendly 40B. I know that. I had one in Littleton. It brought us over 2%, but it created 200 units at the Acton town line away from everything. It's not near the center of town. It's not near transportation. It's not near jobs. It's just as far away as it could possibly be from the rest of the town. And so if we're below 10% and we have an approved housing production plan, we can still achieve what's called safe harbor and keep a 40B developer at bay if we meet some kind of interim production goals in the meantime. 8 won't do it. It would be closer to 35. So, so it still requires a lot of work. We are going to have a public forum on the updated housing production plan on Tuesday, November 15th at 7 p.m. on Zoom. The draft plan document will be available for public review at the town's website the week before. And like Liz, the message I want to give is for those of you who are disappointed or even angered by the defeat of affordable housing measures in Concord this year, I'd urge you to channel that grief by just diving into the housing production plan process right now. That's what I'm doing. Next slide, please. And as we undertake this effort, I wanted to share a reading list for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in addition to Lily's book, which I was delighted to read, and I'm just so glad that she's on the panel with us, I want to commend 2 others to you. Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, from 2017. And, of course, anything that Ibram X. Kendi writes, but in particular, How to Be an Anti-Racist, from 2019. I'll just briefly touch on those 2 other authors. Rothstein, in looking at actually, what I want to say, Rothstein kicked off an event which launched the MAPC's update of our regional plan. We thought enough of his writing, and I was president of MAPC at the time, that we wanted to set the right tone for what did we hope to achieve with our next regional plan, which we've just completed and I'll talk about. So Rothstein found that until the last quarter of the 20th century, racially explicit policies of federal, state, and local governments defined where whites and African Americans should live. Today's racial segregation in the North, South, Midwest, and West is not the unintended consequence of individual choices and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but rather it's of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the United States. It was so systematic and forceful, its effects endure today. And without the government's purposeful imposition of racial segregation. The other causes, private prejudice, white flight, real estate steering, bank redlining, income differences, and self-segregation would still have existed, but with far fewer opportunities for expression. Kendi, Ibram X. Kendi, who I would also say, in addition to many other public appearances, keynoted the Thoreau Society's 2020 annual gathering, which unfortunately was not in person, it was on Zoom, but they had him ready to go in person right up till COVID. He began his book with this definition: an anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. And to understand the difference between racist and anti-racist policies, Kendi says, first look at racial inequity and racial equity. Racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. He gives us an example: 71% of white families lived in owner-occupied homes in 2014, 71%, compared to 45% of Latinx families and 41% of black families. Racial equity is when two or more of the groups stand relatively equal footing. So an example of racial equity would have been if those percentages were relatively the same, whether it be in the 40s, 70s, or better yet, 90s. And that an anti-racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial equity. Anti-racist policy sustains racial equity between racial groups. So let's look at, for some further guidance on what land use, zoning, and housing policies meet Kendi's definition. Next slide, please. This is an excerpt from MetroCommon 2050, which is the regional plan for Metro Boston, which was adopted earlier this year by the Metropolitan Area Council. Its action areas include homes for everyone, shown here, but also into other areas like climate change and transportation and forms of governance. But we'll focus on housing for everyone. One recommendation is to ensure that all people, all races and income levels have equal access to affordable housing through home ownership and rental opportunities in every community. Another is to accelerate the production of diverse housing types throughout the region, particularly deed-restricted affordable housing, with a focus on transit-oriented, climate-resilient, and other smart growth measures. There are specific projects we can talk about, but to get through the slides, I'm going to move on to the next slide. All right, well, this is, as Liz noted, there are a lot of housing entities in Concord, and there are lots of ways to be part of Concord's housing team. Some of the entities listed here have vacancies, in fact, and filling a vacancy is often an opportunity to bring more diversity to a board. The Concord Housing Development Corporation statute says it's to have at least 5 members, They have, according to the website, 4 now. Could have more. My own committee, the Concord Municipal Affordable Housing Trust, our bylaw says that we're to have between 5 and 7 members. We've got 5. It sounds like there's room for 2. And appointments are made by the select board, so it seems to me if anyone's interested in being on one of these entities, there's please apply. Please let us know. For those of you in the room or watching on Zoom who are registered to vote, you're already on our team as town meeting members. And that's what we'll ultimately be bringing all the zoning bylaws and funding requests for approval. So please mark your calendars. 2 dates we know already. January 19th, 2023 is a special town meeting, which will take up, from a housing standpoint anyway, we'll take up home rule petitions that we want to refile to fund the Affordable Housing Trust with a real estate transfer fee and a building permit surcharge. Those were approved in 2019. We need to get a fresh approval for the legislature. Will also be, the Community Preservation Committee also voted last night that they want to have a couple of articles to redirect $1 million in their CPA funds from the now defunct Junction Village project for 83 units of assisted living instead to Assabet River Bluff's 5 units. Sound good to you? Does that math work for you? But we can't spend the money on the 83 because that project went away for reasons beyond our control. So we're left with 5. Town meeting, the annual town meeting starts April 30th. Include smaller lot sizes for residential units. Usually a smaller lot size is smaller than 1 acre. In order to get more development. Multifamily is a use by right. Accessory dwelling units is a use by right. So-called MBTA communities, multifamily is a use by right near a commuter rail station, but with inclusionary zoning included. And what's important here is that just last Friday, the state revised its guidelines to make clearer that you can adopt MBTA multifamily use by right and require that 10% of it be affordable. And we ought to do that. We ought to make sure that we do that. We'll also bring dedicated funding sources for affordable housing to January's town meeting. And last word is infrastructure, water and sewer chief among them, that is so necessary for housing production. From my work in Provincetown and Littleton, where we put sewers in for economic development and housing, I can tell you that I know that it takes a sewer to make a village. So Concord's future is now. Let's write Concord's next chapter together, and thanks very much for being part of our team.
All right, so tonight, so far we've heard a little bit of history, a little bit about action, a little bit about policy and process, and so now we are going to hear from you all. So our first question for our panelists tonight comes from the audience. It states simply, what about affordable housing land trusts? Land trusts have sometimes been exclusionary, but in some cases have helped to expand access for underrepresented people with limited means, and others. So what about affordable housing land trusts?
Do you know anything about this?
I can say that we have, the state has adopted affordable housing trusts, which is a funding bank that allows you to segregate money. I don't know of an affordable housing land trust. It's always hardest to find the land for the housing, but the Affordable Housing Trust that Keith mentioned that he's the chair of is the state statute that Concord adopted, and that really deals with the money and the funding part.
Yeah, I'd have to similarly duck the question, and in part because I've not dealt with with housing land trusts that as an entity. I had an inquiry recently. One of the other places that I work on or volunteer for housing is Nantucket, which either is exploring a land trust as a means of acquiring property. I will say, as a volunteer for the nonprofit Housing Nantucket, which like CHDC is great in Concord because you need to have a nonprofit entity that can do the work and not be a public entity. And on Nantucket, it's the nonprofit Housing Nantucket. And our number one priority is the acquisition of land. Because over there, you can move houses, and they move more houses than any other community, because they don't tear down they make McMansions, but they move the house first to somewhere else as part of their historic district commission. And so land is what we need, and if there's an entity that can help, that we can work with, that helps us identify land. If anyone watching here wants to, the trust can take land if you want to put us in your estate planning, so that you want to leave land to some entity. The Concord Municipal Affordable Housing Trust can accept land. I think the CHDC can do that as well. So, but land having the land is a key consideration.
Lily, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, they unmuted, now I'm unmuted. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more focused on the past, but I have heard of this happening in various different parts of the country, and also for many marginalized groups coming together in more collective action. I would think the biggest issue is cost, and the fact that in Concord, I mean, my understanding and from the slide that was shown of just the cost of purchasing land in a lot of communities. So I think that there's ways, if that's not a factor, then I think there's a lot of possibility to it as a solution.
Thank you. So the next question comes from the audience as well. This is for Liz. Are Concord Select Board members passionate supporters of affordable housing?
I think like many administrations, that people come and go as they're voted in and voted out. So that over time, there's been more support than in other boards, less support.
Fair.
We have a supporter in the room now, Linda. Linda Escobedo is here tonight.
For Keith, how enforceable is the housing production plan?
It's not enforceable. If it were, the Junction Village would have gone forward, because it was in the plan approved by the Select Board in 2016. So it is it's a policy document. Notwithstanding that, I think that it has great weight if all of the entities are in agreement of what the goals are to be achieved, and then work together for as long as we can until we can't stand each other anymore. But the state views it as a critical document, and we're approaching it in good faith. That I will say the Housing Production Plan Steering Committee is putting some of those measures that I had up on my last slide in there, and I hope they survive. I hope they survive review by the Select Board and the Planning Board.
Appreciate it. For Lily, what role does wastewater capacity and sewer line extension policy play in housing equity?
I think it's a big question. It's something I don't know a huge amount about, but I think especially in communities that have limited sewer capacity or have not put the money into those kinds of resources, it does create huge types of questions. So, I mean, I think in the example of the Wheeler property, like there are issues that it was in the late 1960s, early 1960s, marginal land, and so there's a question of like, why are land where there are existing problems, the places where affordable housing is cited. I think that goes to the point that Liz made about on the land that's former prison land, like that's, I mean, places that are not always the most desirable. So that is a question. But I do think having access to quality sewer and water systems is really important when trying to build new housing.
I could.
Yeah, continue.
Yeah. I could address that as well, and I'll point to two of the communities that I work for, Provincetown and Littleton. In Provincetown, the sewer was everything. We couldn't have a town without a sewer. In fact, we had no sewer, and we had to build one, and it took from 1993 until 2003 to do the planning and construction for the first phase. But and it was done with the idea that we needed to have a community when we were done, and having affordable housing as part of the sewer plan was critical, so that but because we had limited effluent disposal areas, that we could only sewer about 20% of the total capacity of the town, which ended up being just the areas of Commercial Street and along the harbor. But to that, we made an exception that if it were affordable housing or something else that we wanted, year-round economic development, that they could have a sewer hookup, and that we would extend the sewer line to them. Not that the town would pay for those, but that they would at least give you the capacity. So as a result, when the Provincetown Housing Authority was able to get a 3-acre site on which we could put 100 units, got the land at half price from Cumberland Farms, that they got a sewer. They got a sewer hookup, and that housing is there. The other example more recently is, and a lot of this happened after I left in 2018, but if you look at what's happening in Littleton now, the bad news for Littleton is that IBM left, that 500,000 square foot location or building in Littleton Common was vacated, IBM left. But the town used that as an opportunity that IBM had not wanted a sewer hookup. We'd been planning a sewer hookup for years. The new developer wants a sewer hookup, and now that developer has a planning board approval for 720 residential units and mixed use, so that there will be commercial uses there. Now, because Littleton had passed an inclusionary zoning amendment years ago, at the time that they established their Affordable Housing Trust, and that 10% of those units that I talked about will be affordable. Wow. How much did the town pay for that? Nothing. So that's I think that's a critical, sewer is everything. It does take a sewer to make a village.
All right. So the next one's going to be for Liz. The audience would like to know, what is the way forward for Concord when it comes to affordable housing? And the question ends with, how do you motivate supporters? I guess what I'd add to that is, what do you see is missing from those people who mean well but don't often show up?
Oh. Well, I think showing up really and supporting the projects that come before the voters. I think that zoning will come before the voters for town meetings, so it's important. Usually, as I say, it's the opponents that come. So let's say it's town meeting, it's 8 o'clock at night, and it's kind of like, I don't really want to go, and this, but all the opponents are going to come there. And so just showing up to vote support for anything that has housing in it. The money for housing, the zoning for housing. Keith mentioned the committees. The Concord Housing Development Corporation is very active. They have 2 properties to build affordable housing on, and they would love people, one person even, to join them in, in very active, like making it happen. And there are opportunities like that as well.
Liz, can I just follow up with,
Sure.
I find when people ask what should I do, a lot of times they're looking for motivation. What's your motivation to continue to fight?
So I think having a diverse community is really, as I say, is like a benefit. It's a cultural benefit to the entire town. I used my example of West Concord, like everyone loves that look, or the Concord Center. And so building denser housing should be our goal. right? Like, we want denser housing, we want it in the places that make the most sense, near the train stations, this, and to bring in a younger population to kind of fill the ranks as, you know, as we age, right? Like, that's what we do, we age, right? You know, there's no surprises there, right? And, but I think that, so it's really for the community, for enriching the community, and the community needs more diversity. The price of housing is exclusionary. Like, you're not going to get young people starting off unless they're like the trust fund babies or something, you know, whatever, like they can't come. So, so you need more lower priced housing to enrich the community. So I think that's what I think the motivation is to build a better Concord.
Thank you. Lily, if we could rewrite history, were there turning points that would have changed our outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think one of the major ones has to do with zoning and particular decisions, a particular sort of establishment of zoning policies in the really starting from the 1930s, but especially the 1950s and 60s, that have shaped not just Concord, but many communities in huge ways. And I think, you know, I'll build on Keith's reference to books like The Color of Law, which are hugely important, and I teach that book, and you know, there's many established years of scholarship on those topics. But I think when there's a lot of discussion of redlining, but I do think this issue, I think one of the questions around exclusionary zoning and the impact that zoning has had in creating inequity is huge. And so I do think going where the other part of that is that zoning is not created by God, so it is like these are policies and that they can be actually undone. I mean, you can't. So there's a way of that's a place that I actually see there's a potential for change too. I think that's a huge part. I think that you know, there's a lot of these smaller fights that happen, and those, I don't know if those would have the same kind of impact, but I do think a lot of the sort of the patterns that get established in the places like the 1950s and 60s then sort of becoming embedded and then sort of reproduce themselves over the next 50 or 60 years. You
mentioned in your presentation the idea around conservation societies as, I don't want to say it was a ploy, but as a tool to continue to try to conserve, I guess, land for a specific purpose. Is it possible for a person to be in favor of those kinds of open spaces, conservation on the one hand, and also be in favor of affordable housing on the other?
Absolutely. I think those are not mutually exclusive categories at all. And it's not to say that there's not, you know, that all just build wherever is possible, and I think there's a lot of value to the purposes of to preserving spaces in various different forms. And I think the question is when they get used as tools for exclusivity, and it's a marker of not actually trying to and using that as a mechanism for other kinds of things. So ideally, in the 1950s and 60s, what would have happened was at the same time sort of open space activists were working on that issue, is then to also think about affordable housing. And so it's actually thinking about keeping two things in your head at the same time, and thinking more collectively. Mm-hmm. I think another huge question is just it's really important to think locally, but I think the other issue is not thinking about the larger metropolitan community and the ways in which certain kinds of practices like preserving open space, having zoning that restricts industry and commercial development, and not having any multi-unit housing has huge impacts on the larger metropolitan area, and creates all kinds of inequity. So it's both thinking about the communal level, but it's also thinking about the larger metropolis.
Thank you.
Can I add something to
that? Of course.
Yeah, so last year, Concord had a great example of that in the Assabet River Bluff project, which was a private parcel that was offered for sale, and it was purchased, and some of the land is dedicated for housing, and some of it is preserved for open space. So it was one property that now is divided, and there's a part for affordable housing and for open space. So that's an example that we have right here from last year.
So Keith, what are your thoughts about multi-floor buildings with apartments above? What's the viability of that? And
I'm sorry?
so what are your thoughts about multi-floor buildings with apartments above them? What's the viability of that? What have you seen with that being effective in trying to maintain housing?
Yeah, mixed-use housing with residences on upper floors, that describes Provincetown that describes what it looked like across from my office for 17 years. And for some reason, zoning, and I appreciate that Lily reminds us God didn't make it. Sometimes I think it was the devil. But whoever it was, it only requires a simple majority vote now to change zoning that increases housing supply. And that's thanks to the Housing Choice Initiative of Governor Baker that MAPC was pleased to support, because there used to be a 2/3 vote. It's not that way anywhere else. All the rest of New England that has town meetings, it's only a simple majority vote to pass zoning. But the mixed-use zoning is vibrant. It's what the zoning that did not have good intentions required that different uses be in different districts. That killed a lot of very vibrant downtown areas or places that could have become vibrant because the zoning said you had to separate them. And I'm very much in favor of mixed use where there are residential uses, say up above, and the storefronts have. In fact, that Cumberland Farms property I was talking about in Provincetown with all the housing, the storefront that comes out on Champaign Road is businesses. So.
This is for all panelists. How do we get people the information they need to be informed citizens about the Junction Village situation, for example? Some folks just have opportunities to read about it in the Concord Bridge, but where are some other places or spaces where people can get information around these topics?
So for that particular project, there's the town website really has a lot of information about many things and has a whole page dedicated to the Junction Village with a link to every significant piece of information about that particular project. So it's always a tricky thing, communication, right? So the town does a good job of publicizing all the information, but as as citizens and residents, we have an obligation to look for information, for things that interest us too. So it's a two-way street communication goes. So I think we're fortunate to have the Concord Bridge, the new newspaper in town. So we have a promise for more news delivered to our doorstep, right? So so hopefully that can help us as well.
So for Lily, in addition to the documented effects of the GI mortgage loans, what about redlining and predatory lending as destructive banking policies? Could you speak on?
You mean their history? I mean, they're hugely destructive and are really the basis of the forces of residential segregation in metropolitan Boston and around the country. So I mean, in many ways, that's the kind of foundation for a lot of the kinds of the patterns that happen. And the fact, I mean, to go back to the reason that you only have middle class families able to purchase homes in Concord in the 1950s and 1960s, and then in some ways beyond. What that is the fact that most African Americans could not get a conventional loan because of the FHA policies explicitly forbid allowing loans to people who are going to move into and potentially integrate neighborhoods. And so really you had to use, an African American family would have to use a white buyer to go in and various different other things, or to basically buy their houses with cash. And I think the real pattern that it does is to create the large-scale racial wealth gap in the United States, given that for much of the country's history, what the GI Bill really did, and all of these federal housing policies that are the legacy of the New Deal, is to create an asset that could then be passed, that would accumulate wealth and be passed on. And so when we think about the kind of large-scale racial disparities, a large percentage of that comes from these kinds of policies. that have huge impacts. And I think the questions around sort of how banking operates, I mean, there have been lots of efforts, you know, there were laws that have been passed over the years to try to address these problems. There's been persistent racial discrimination that is embedded into both the real estate markets and to banking policies that persist into the present. So those are that all sort of flows from a lot of those kinds of New Deal policies, and we see their effects today.
Thank you. For the Thoreau Depot rezoning, why didn't the consultant recommend higher than 3 floors for that project?
Well, that's getting right into it, isn't it, right? So I believe, so it was really the town, it wasn't the consultant, right? So MAPC that Keith talked to was assisting the town, but it was the town's planning board that crafted the zoning and had many conversations. So they allowed a 4th floor by special permit only. So it wasn't to be, I think that was the question of why was there more than 3 floors allowed, right? Mm-hmm. And so the straight zoning was 3 floors, and an additional floor was by special permit in certain circumstances. And some of it has to do with how you measure the floors, right? It's like up to the roof line or here, and the grade of the ground. And so in certain aspects, you know, it seemed that they wanted to have that ability for the planning board to allow that in a situation. Once you pass zoning, I mean, you can't really change zoning, right? I mean, you have to change it through town meeting. So it's always important to allow some exceptions or the permit issuing authority to have some discretion for the project that makes the most sense for that project, you know, past the base conditions.
And so I'm not sure if this is about the legality or the possibility of this, but could the town of Concord be both the developer and the builder for these projects? Would that mitigate some of the issues that we find?
Yeah, well, I'll just keep
You
talking.
can start with the money, and I'll talk about the politics.
So the way public construction works is, and that would be public construction, so the town is often the developer, like when they, you know, fix up buildings and facilities, or, you know, like let's say the new school, that the town's going to hire contractors to do that work, and those go under public procurement and public construction regulations, and that adds 40% to the cost of every project. So it's very expensive for public entities to do construction. So they have the powers to do that, but it doesn't make economic sense in many situations. And that's why Keith mentioned having a nonprofit organization like Concord has the Concord Housing Development Corporation that is not subject to those regulations. So it's a much more efficient way to develop housing than the town itself. But the town could take the property and do that kind of construction.
I'd want to agree completely with Liz that from a policy standpoint, having a nonprofit or non-town entity do the development makes the most sense. I'm just wondering, and this is just facetious, but from a political standpoint, if the town itself, or if the town's governing bodies don't trust a private contractor, then they ought to try it themselves and at 40% premium cost and see if they feel better about it being in charge of the project rather than just throwing stones at it.
Yeah. So for those of you on Zoom, the nature of the statement was the history of the housing authority in Concord was rich in trying to open up spaces for disenfranchised or non-centered people, and they were also heralded at that time, even though they were at the back end of that push, as being a group of folks in the public sphere that were opening up opportunities and spaces in places that had not yet caught up. And so I think that a way to summarize that is Concord does have a history of some good in this work, and there is still so far to go. And so I appreciate that insight. That is our final question, but I do think that we have, a small surprise for some folks? Is that what you said? No, we're all set? No surprise? Oh, okay, sorry. So the surprise is, Thank you, and have a good evening. We appreciate you so much.